There's a lot of power in food and food systems. There's the power of care and nurturing, the power of regeneration and resilience. There's the power to feed, the power to refuse food, and the power to transform landscapes. And then there's the power of petroleum, of data, of GMOs and pesticides, of fertilizer, of tractors and land grabbing. Oh my! Welcome to Digesting Food Studies, the podcast that aims to redistribute power and decentralize knowledge, share research openly, and make pluralism the name of the game. I'm your mixmaster and potholder, David Santo. This episode explores several themes related to the centralization of power in food systems, particularly related to the ways in which corporations and governments operate and control spaces of production and transformation. We probe financialization, land ownership, the tools of production, and the roles of policy. The issue of Canadian Food Studies in Focus this time is Volume 2, Number 2, which we published way back in 2015. It was a themed issue called Mapping the Global Food Landscape and included a section on financialization in the food system, a clarion call from 10 years ago that has become ever more pertinent today. As usual, Alexia Moyer starts the episode off with an amuse-bouche segment that grounds us in the human scale of food. Through her description of Brian Brett's book, Trauma Farm, she helps us imagine a state of agriculture that is anything but centralized and corporate. After that, I talk with Jennifer Clapp about the themed issue of CFS she co-guest edited with Annette Desmarais and Matthias Margulis, and more specifically about corporate control in our food systems. We also mention her insightful new book, Titans of Industrial Agriculture, which looks at how vast portions of the farm machinery, fertilizer, seed, and pesticide markets are controlled by just a few transnationals. It's both troubling and fascinating. Finally, wrapping things up, PhD student Heidi Janes reflects on a number of CFS articles about the centralization of power, including some examples from the current day that illustrate how deeply problematic this is for food justice, security, and sovereignty. So, Alexia, later on, I'll be talking to Jennifer Clapp about centralization of power in the food system, things like financialization and land grabbing. But today you're bringing us to a somewhat more human scale of things when it comes to farming. Tell us about how things might be.
Yes, I wanted to take you on a farm tour by way of a book, Trauma Farm, A Rebel History of Rural Life by Brian Brett. Brian Brett was a poet and journalist, an editor, a memoirist, and he spent nearly 30 years on a small mixed farm on Salt Spring Island.
In British Columbia?
In British Columbia, yeah.
Ah, okay.
He has been quoted as saying, "I write poetry to support my farming habit."
He sounds like a man who lived high on the hog.
He says this says a great deal about the financial realities of farming, the profit margins or lack thereof, where the need for diversification is determined by the scale. In terms of positionality, Brett would and does very clearly places farm work in opposition to the logic of the factory farm or intensive animal farming. So what kind of a farmer is he? Well, for one thing, he names his animals.
That's a dangerous practice in my experience.
Yes, one does suggest not to name what you're going to eat. But there is here Gertrude, a feisty hen who takes to laying her eggs in their mudroom, more specifically in Brett's toolbox because she likes it better in the house. Mm-hmm. There's the 18-hand, 20-year-old semi-retired show horse named Stonewall Jackson, who will steal your bacon and egg breakfast and the toast if he gets the opportunity.
This is a well-fed menagerie.
Yeah. And another thing is that the work that he does and the books that he reads are imbricated, both on the page and on the farm. So he has a stack of books by Henry David Thoreau. He's reading Ronald Wright's A Short History of Progress, Rouge Patel's Stuffed and Starved, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and Jean-Henri Fabre, The Insect World of J. Henri Fabre, to name a few. But also having worked with a shovel or the rototiller in the garden, he knows firsthand the need for a gardener to have a cast iron back with a hinge on it. Or a trip to collect eggs reminds him of Sappho's description of it written 26 centuries ago. But then again, he'll talk to you about which hens are the best brooders, which he says are bantams, because they'll try and hatch a smooth round stone if you place it under them. They're that dedicated.
He's a poet, he's an engineer, he's a philosopher, he's a theorist, and he's a practitioner.
Yeah, and he's one who he gets his hands dirty, but then he'll look at the earth, that clump of earth in his hands, and he's seeing a diverse ecosystem. He's seeing that it's made up of fungi and bacteria and protozoa, nematodes, mites, microarthropods, amoebas, flagellates, and maybe a fat earthworm. Then a tiny beetle rushing out of the dirt and skipping off his finger back to its source. He's interested in new methodologies. He's interested in traditional knowledge. He's up on the Canadian government regulations, and he sees farming, like poetry, as more than just a job. It's a calling for him.
He is everything. He's a pluralist.
He is. And now, to get to Trauma Farm, why is it called Trauma Farm?
Mm-hmm.
The official legal name of the farm was Willow Pond Farm, but it came to be known affectionately as Trauma Farm because, as Brett writes, we soon realized beauty also demands a little terror and laughter. And there is some terror in his descriptions of battery chicken productions at its worst. 5 birds to a cage as small as 20 by 18 inches by 16 inches. Their beaks melted off so they wouldn't cannibalize each other. Their feet growing into the cage wires as they choked on the dust. Their bodies spattered with manure, forced to undergo artificial molting using regulated elimination cycles and starvation. And then, before they were 2 years old, every chicken recycled for chicken product. Bon appétit, as he says.
Yeah. We know the practices of industrial farming, in particular of animal production, are appalling. And even worse when it gets into the scale of, as Jennifer will tell us, things like financialization. But what he's describing is the other end of the spectrum in some ways. The incredibly relational, decentralized power of a place that is kind of an ecology of humans and animals and beliefs and practices and ways of doing.
And he also describes terror and trauma in his own experience with slaughtering his own animals, where regulation allows. The chicken already dead, shaking wildly as it releases its natural electricity. This is the dance of the death of the nervous system.
Right. Oh, wow.
There is also room for laughter, and he recounts their favorite ewe, Butterball, who gets her head stuck in a bucket and can't get it off as the rest of the flock flees in horror.
That's an image. That is beautiful.
So what's the takeaway from Trauma Farm? What I would like you to leave with Trauma Farm is Brett's reminder that farming can be logical and it can be rational, as well as being non-linear and intuitive. And the book is structured as a long day in June during the summer solstice, and every chapter is a portion of that day. So that's a logical and rational form. And yet in its digressions, in its anecdotes, its meandering through and back in time, it's also non-linear and intuitive. So Brian Brett writes like he farms. Form echoes content here. And if we were to reduce a farm to a quarterly report, we would be missing out on the complex world of interactions that exists outside of that very limiting and simplistic structure.
Wow. It sounds like a beautiful read.
I'll lend it to you.
Yeah, I will happily read it. It's the linear, nonlinear format is particularly appealing. And maybe that's something that we could all strive to adopt in our food worlds, whatever they be. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Jennifer Clapp is a Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. She is a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. Generally considered a political scientist, she was recently named as the 2026 Honorary Geographer by the American Association of Geographers. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us here on Digesting Food Studies. I'm so excited to talk to you about corporate power and financialization and all the terrible things that happen in the food systems.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, David. Delightful to be here.
I think one of the first times I became aware of your work, but also of this idea of financialization in the food systems was way back in 2015 when we at Canadian Food Studies published an issue that you co-guest edited called Mapping the Global Food Landscape. And it was a very, very large, it was our biggest issue ever. And it had a whole lot of different themes and subjects around how global food systems have been affected by corporate power, by centralization of power, by capitalism, by financialization, and many, many other things. But since then, you've been doing so many different things, still within this larger theme of corporate and centralized power. Can you tell us a little bit about how your trajectory through these themes has taken place?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've always been interested in the ways in which the workings of the global political economy affect food systems in different ways. So I've spent a lot of time looking at problems of international trade and food systems, issues of growing financialization in food systems, as well as corporate power and the role of transnational corporations. Yeah, that special issue that you're referring to, it actually covers all of those themes and a few more, because we were trying to see how food systems are affected by these dynamics in global politics broadly, as well as the global political economy specifically. And that really came out of the work that I'd been doing around that time for my book, which is called Food.
A fantastic book, explains things so clearly.
Well, thank you. In that book, I tease out what I call the industrialization, the globalization, the corporatization, and financialization of food. And so we really wanted to tease that out by getting other authors coming in and bringing their perspectives onto these issues. At that moment, I was really obsessed with this problem of financialization in food systems, because I was becoming more and more aware, especially after the 2008 food crisis, about the ways in which financial actors, financial institutions, financial motives were playing a big role in shaping food systems and food system outcomes. And around that time was particularly a moment where speculative financial actors, financial investors in global financial markets were investing in food systems through the investment in grain futures markets, which are basically a financial investment instrument for a lot of these players. And that was bidding up food prices and contributing to an exacerbation of world hunger because people were lacking access to food. And that practice of financial speculation it was very controversial, let's say, around that time. And I think it still remains controversial today, because many economists say, wait a minute, we need these speculators in the market to bring liquidity, and it makes these markets function. But at the same time, we know these financial investors are profiting hugely off of rising food prices. And that, it looks pretty much from a critical perspective like they're profiting from hunger.
I think this concept of financialization struck me so hard because it was such a clear marker of, okay, food has stopped being food. In the same way that sort of subsistence farming turning into commodity farming, turning into tradable stocks, turning into these financial instruments, as you call them, but like paper-based products that are not actually food. They are connected to food. They're attached to food. They influence food. But when we're talking about food in people's mouths, and as you say, hunger, like this central issue that is pretty dominant around the world, we're getting away from food being food and we're turning it into this tradable thing that then is subject to all the fluctuations of financial markets instead of people making food for people to eat. But then beyond that, there's all this other stuff that you're exploring in terms of other ways that corporate and capitalist powers are doing stuff to food that maybe should never happen. Can you tell us a bit about that, including maybe what you have just written about in your new book, the corporatization of the inputs to food and agriculture?
Yeah, and you put your finger on it directly there, David, that food and agriculture have become distanced from their actual functions, where they serve people's daily needs for nourishment, for livelihoods, for culture, for community, and have become these instruments of financial betting, really, on global financial markets. And I would say it's not just food that's become financialized in that way, but also farmland. And in a way that is interrupting or denying people their rights, the right to food, the right to livelihoods, the right to their traditional lands. And so it's a huge concern, as you say. And really, the corporate power aspect is so entangled with the financial aspect that's why I started to get more and more interested also in the corporate piece of it, because as I was researching the financial markets and discovering it was asset management companies are also really engaged in this financial investment, and they're often investing in the companies that dominate along agri-food supply chains. And so you've suddenly got this interlocking power of financial firms and food firms that are then given incentive to get bigger and bigger and more powerful, because it serves the interests of financial investors and it serves these companies as they get more powerful. So just to say, briefly how interconnected these kinds of relationships are and the kind of power they have and the influence that they have. But yeah, you mentioned my new book, which is called Titans of Industrial Agriculture, How a Few Corporations Came to Dominate the Farm Sector and Why It Matters.
A long title, but an important title.
For sure. But yeah, in that book, I'm really looking at the long history of concentration in the farm input sector. So I'm talking about farm machinery, fertilizers, seeds, and pesticides. And in each of those four kind of industries that make up the input sector, we've seen corporate concentration develop over the course of the last couple of hundred years. And what was really striking in looking at that was the extent to which it was already concentrated by the late 19th and early 20th century. All of those sectors were quite concentrated, dominated by either mercantile traders or big giant companies. So there was a huge merger in 1902 that combined 7 farm machinery companies, and they controlled 85% of the farm harvesting equipment in the U.S. In 1902.
Well, this is astounding because we often think about industrialized farming as being recent or post-World War II, but it's been going on for literally centuries. This consolidation of power and consolidation of wealth to control. It feels like we've gone again into a strange twilight zone where food stopped being food and farming stopped being farming, and it just became part of a giant interlocked capitalist system that is global, literally, and that is also then stripping the rights of traditional farmers, of indigenous peoples, of anybody who has an inherent history and connection to the land that is not theirs anymore.
Yeah, and that process I found it really fascinating that process began so long ago. And I kind of trace it to the rise of the farm machinery industry first. And that was around the 1830s and 40s that industry really took off. And a lot of it was the product of the fact that there was less labor available in North American farms and a lot of land. And so there was this technological innovation that was trying to solve that problem.
Right.
But by solving that problem, it created all these new demands within the system that suddenly more land was being harvested. So it led to more confiscation of land from indigenous peoples in North America. So pushing people off the land. Then we had larger farms. Then suddenly there was this need for uniform seeds, because if you have a machine that's doing the harvesting, it needs to have a uniform crop in the field.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, once you do that, you're kind of mining the soil. So you need more fertilizer. And once you do all of that stuff, you're going to have more weeds and more pests because of the monoculture production. And so it kind of created this big, giant, locked-in industrial production mode that really took off in North America. And once North America did that and started exporting those crops around the world, it was really difficult for other countries to compete because of this industrial model. So it kind of encouraged its global adoption. But in doing so, it generated so many problems, like poisoning from pesticides, destruction of the soil from the use of synthetic fertilizers, overuse of fossil fuels, seed uniformity, loss of biodiversity. Yeah.
Right. And this endless sort of upward spiraling of the need for technocratic solutions instead of humanocentric or multi-species solutions. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways, or a self-fulfilling market reality that one thing demands the other, demands the other. As you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, once financial players get involved in food markets, it becomes a requirement for them to stay involved in these food markets. And so then you can't extract them without systems falling apart. And then it just keeps spiraling upwards.
Exactly. And those processes really benefited a certain number of firms that were there at the right moment. They were there at the right time. Right. They benefited from access to big financial investors. They benefited from government policies that handed them a lot of goodies along the way. And they benefited from being in the right place at the right time for technological change. And those incumbents, they were there. There's this link now to all the big firms today, go back really many decades, if not over a century. They're still powerful.
And they will remain so, presumably. Well, meanwhile, we do other things in the world. We look at sustainable regional food systems. We look at agroecology. We look at traditional food practices. And we continue to try to maybe not counter, but build parallels, build other structures that are good and that may sustain us in different ways. So do you see a projection of how this pathway from the history of centralization of power towards financialization, towards ongoing control mechanisms like, say, for example, digital agriculture and precision agriculture that is only requiring farmers to be more and more locked into contracts with their suppliers? Let's look at the dark side first. What's the negative potential future that we are getting towards?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think if we do nothing, we are just going to march blindly into this, what I would consider a dystopian future of agriculture without people. agriculture that takes away people's agency, choice, that takes away our ability to address these environmental concerns. So I think really what it comes down to is this kind of a system, because it is not human-centric, it strips people of their rights and their agency, and it damages the environment that we live in.
Yeah.
I do wake up every day hopeful that we can reverse these trends, or if I didn't, I would stop doing what I'm doing and get really depressed. But I think there are ways we can address these kinds of concentration, these kinds of financialization, the kind of technological lock-ins that in some ways involve better state policies. But I do recognize it's a problem because these corporations have captured states and they influence their policies. And that's a kind of like complicated relationship there between industry and government. But government is one of the only actors that can put policies and regulations in place that can move the practices of these kinds of companies. So it could involve better financial regulation, for example, to stop speculation. It could involve better antitrust or competition policies to stop corporations from getting so big and powerful in the first place, or even breaking up companies when they get too big and abuse their power. It could involve governments putting research and development dollars into agroecology, putting money into infrastructure for territorial markets to really relocalize to an extent food systems. Not saying we need to do away with all world trade, but we can, like the government has the power to do things to shift food systems, I think, in a better direction. And I think that has to be coupled with community action, because we can't just assume governments are going to do this. They're often doing what corporations ask. And so there needs to be public demand for change. And that has to happen through these kind of alternatives that you're mentioning, like stepping out of the industrial system and purchasing your foods in alternative systems. But I don't think we should be only doing one thing or the other. I think we have to do multiple things at the same time if we really want to affect that kind of change.
Yeah.
And I would say maybe on a hopeful note, given the turmoil in the world right now and the crazy tariffs that the U.S. administration is throwing out at every other country, and it's a crisis of, I would say it's playing out in food systems in a big way and really disrupting the status quo. And the status quo wasn't great.
Yeah.
I'm not in support of the kinds of things that are going on. However, in crisis, you can find opportunities. And we're seeing more and more states, especially developing countries in the global south, really rethinking their dependence on these global markets. They're really rethinking their connection to these global corporate and financial actors. And that could be a wedge. It could be an opening for reimagining food systems to operate in a different way. And I think within Canada, there's a big opportunity there as well to disentangle our food system, which is way too entangled with the U.S. right now, that we can reimagine how we want our food system to operate.
Well, let's do that. And here's a call out to all those of you who are working in activism, agroecology, policy translation. We need those policy translators between food studies and the actual government policy influencers. Please do that work and listen to everything that Jennifer has to say. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation and part of the podcast. And I can't wait to finish reading your new book.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Heidi Janes is a PhD student in political science at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. In addition to her work examining corporate power in the food system, Heidi is interested in how philanthropic and humanitarian logics play roles in the political economy of food and food systems.
My name is Heidi Janes. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Wasatch peoples. The themes that guide my research currently are corporate power in the food system very broadly, as well as how philanthropic and humanitarian logics play a role in the political economy of food. So I'm really interested in the ways that corporations position themselves within civil society networks, as well as within formal food governance mechanisms. For example, I've looked at corporate influence on the Canadian Food Policy Advisory Council and how corporations are enacting what Somerville calls reparative capitalism. A second theme that guides my work is how we understand the historical and contemporary production of hunger, especially in relation to issues such as nutrition. So I try to stay attuned in my work to the discursive power of framing hunger and food insecurity, not as phenomena occurring through gaps in policy or governance, but as produced through our social relations. And as I try now to narrow the topic of my dissertation, it's been really great to review the foundational dynamics connecting finance and food. These articles on financialization bring into view both the historical role that financial instruments have played as an insurance for farmers and the tension introduced by the ability for finance to now distort pathways to a healthy food system. One implication from the articles most relevant to my interests is that financial actors' ability to reshape agriculture is tied to their ability to shape policy and regulatory frameworks on a wider scale. So through the untangling of the financialization of food, we're provided with a window into the politics of law and of policy as they intersect with corporate power. For example, in the articles, we see that it's through legal infrastructure that the imperatives of financial actors are made real, such as pressures from shareholders or the obligation to provide returns for pensions. And it's also through the creation of legal architecture that theoretical value is derived from agricultural resources and commodities, such as the specialized investment instruments that have allowed for the large-scale acquisition of land globally. I also appreciate that the articles capture a temporal moment in the financialization of food, and this presents, I think, a really rich point of departure for our studies now. For instance, we could return to questions posed by Martin in the synthesis that are still relevant today, particularly what is a reasonable role for finance to play. I suggest that we can also use these works to make comparisons with this financial moment 10 years later. And if we look at the financialization of land specifically, a report last year by IPES Food shows that finance has indeed found new ways of making farmland appealing to investors that rely on increasingly complex derivatives and the circumvention of barriers. What's not new, however, is that contemporary land grabs are directly linked to the racial and other forms of discrimination imposed by early European colonialism, which still informs the dispossession of indigenous peoples, peasants, pastoralists, and smallholder farmers of their land today. Martin's intervention that finance sees frontiers rather than limits also feels as relevant as ever to me. The same IPES Food report, for example, highlights a recent push by corporations and states for the digitization of land registries and privately owned blockchain technologies that enable the erasure of customary land rights, which has far-reaching implications for food security. And we also see traces of corporatization and the imperatives of finance when considering recent reporting by the Financial Times on, for example, Boston Consulting Group, a firm that consults on digitization technology for both agribusiness and finance. And that's because BCG's expertise has been implicated in the complex financial modeling used in a relocation scheme targeting Palestinians, including a proposal for land in Gaza to be sold as assets to investors through digital tokens traded on a blockchain. So while these articles pull apart the unique aspects of the financialization of food, I wonder if in this moment the interconnectedness between agri-food and finance itself may be helping to form new frontiers for colonialism on an even wider scale. A report by UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese reminds us that colonial endeavors and associated genocides have historically been driven and enabled by the corporate sector. Albanese's report shows how financial firms, BlackRock and Vanguard, as well as major global banks and sovereign wealth and pension funds, are some of the largest investors in and underwriters of Israel's occupation and genocide. For me, this really brings into stark relief the stakes of examining the compounding power of financial actors, especially in terms of legal and regulatory frameworks, and how, whether we're talking about weapons or food commodities, land and resource grabbing seems central to the imperatives and the power of finance.
I keep coming back to the question of how things got so very centralized in our food systems and what it is about humanity that enables this to happen. I'm by no means knowledgeable about political science or economics, and I know that the systems of capitalism, as well as the motivations of its leaders and decision makers, are immensely complex. It's not really possible to take or find a God's eye view of it all, but at the individual scale of people and plants and animals, I just wonder how we have collectively let this happen. Perhaps what Brian Brett shows us in his book Trauma Farm offers a clue or two. I mean, that it's messy and emotional and painful and difficult to be in close relationship to agriculture every day. It's a wonderful thing, yes, but draining and scary as well. Is there a link between the corporate control and distanciation that's arisen between farming and people and the hard realities of actually being a farmer? Is there hope for a rebalancing or decentralization of power in our food systems? I certainly hope so. My very large thanks to our very large thinking guests today, Alexia Moyer, Jennifer Clapp, and Heidi Janes. Their work and their insights offer us all some important examples of how to make the world a little better, or maybe a lot better. Same to Digesting Food Studies executive producers Rachel Engler-Stringer, Laurence Godin, Charles Levko, Phil Loring, and Kristen Lowett, who are brilliant scholars and wise guides themselves. Check out their work. It's pretty inspiring. And I'm David Santo, a person who's just grateful to know all these folks. Our show notes, as usual, include links to the resources mentioned today and are also available in French, along with the show transcript on foodstudies.info/podcast. When I think about power, I am often led to think about energy and potential and time. My first degree was in chemical physics, so sometimes I revert to science-y parallels when I'm trying to make sense of things. Now, the physical unit for power is the watt, and a watt is equal to a joule per second. A joule is a unit of energy, so power is effectively defined, in physics that is, as the rate at which energy is transferred over time. What does that mean for decentralizing and decorporatizing power? Well, maybe it's something to do with time and what we allow to be transferred or not to those structures that govern what and how we eat. I don't know. It's just a suggestion, a transdisciplinary thought experiment, as it were.